1990 was a great year to be a Muppet. Their new land was about to expand and take over a huge portion of Disney MGM Studios. With themed restaurants, stage shows, parades and rides, and chaos, mayhem, and laughter at every turn. Join us for the very first complete tour of what should have become Muppet Studios. Meet the Imagineers that were creating it, revealing their original designs for the very first time. So sit back as we visit this Muppet land. It's as close as you will ever get to experiencing the Muppet Studio that almost was. This story begins in the late 1980s when a visionary named Jim Henson was being courted by Disney executives to come on board as the creative lead of the Walt Disney Company. Although on the surface, it would seem that Disney's main goal was to purchase the Jim Henson Company so that they could own the Muppet franchise. But there was actually a much greater incentive for Disney to make this acquisition.
What happened was that Disney had attempted to get Jim Henson to be a creative partner. Now, they were buying the Muppets, but what they really were buying was Jim Henson. That's what they wanted, because you had at the time Michael Eisner, who was this marketing genius, and then took the Disney company, and he had found a way to market all of these aspects of the company and then just really turn it into the mega corporation that it is today. And then he also brought on board Frank Wells, who was, this financial guru that, he was so good at managing the money and leveraging things. And he also had Jeffrey Katzenberg, which was taking care of the animation. But what he needed was somebody, a very creative person, to help with the development of that creative process over at Imagineering. And bringing him on board with the Muppets was a way to cultivate that relationship.
Artist Marcello Vignali was only 23 when he joined the Walt Disney Company as an animator. However, a rapid series of being in the right place at the right time circumstances propelled a young Marcello from art school to Disney Animation to Disney Imagineering, and then placed him as part of the core team developing Muppet Studios under the direction of Jim Henson.
When I think of that time when I was working at Disney Imagineering, it was really incredible because it all happened really fast. They had asked me to do some illustration work because I was working in animation. I was working in television animation. And Joe Lanzisro was my animation teacher in art school. And he had said, when you finish with your education, why don't you give me a call? And he gave me his telephone number. I kept his the little piece of paper that he had written his telephone number on. I kept that, but I didn't call him right after I finished art school because I started working at television animation. And about 2.5 years later, I had all this experience working in animation. I gave him a call, and he said, "I'm not working at feature animation anymore. I'm at this place called Imagineering." And I'm like, "What's that?" "Oh, it's where we do all the theme park work." Because you have to figure that this is pre-internet, and Imagineering was sort of like this enigmatic thing. And so he said, "Why don't you come by and have lunch?" So I came by, I had lunch with him. He put my name up to get hired over at Disney. And they brought me in and I showed my portfolio. It was one of those very fortuitous things. I was at the right place, at the right time with the right portfolio. And I had these acrylic paintings in my portfolio. And they saw those and they thought, oh my gosh, there was another project which was for Star Tours that needed to get done. So there were 6 paintings that needed to get done. This particular artist had painted 3 of them, and another 3 needed to get done. And so I had these paintings in my portfolio, and they said, "Well, can you paint in this style?" "Sure, yeah, I can paint in whatever style you need." And so I got the job. So I finished those paintings, and they offered me a full-time position at the studio because it was like a freelance thing. So immediately I started working with Joe Lanzisro. And Joe was doing some things for Splash Mountain, And so I was helping with that. But he was already talking with the Jim Henson group, and he invited me. He says, "How would you like to work with Jim Henson?" I flipped out. I mean, I had just gotten to the studio, and automatically I'm on this project.
Phase 1 of Muppet Studios included theater productions and stage shows. The e-ticket item for this round was Jim Henson's Muppet Vision 3D, a technologically groundbreaking attraction at the time that put audiences right in the center of non-stop Muppet mayhem. A parade of Muppets would wind through Disney MGM greeting guests, starting on Hollywood Boulevard and pulling crowds deeper into the park towards Muppet Studios. There were 2 live attractions. Meet the Muppets was a golden age of Hollywood musical revue, and Muppets on Location, Days of Swine and Roses, was more of a slapstick comedy stage show that included meet and greets with the characters. And for those who wanted to take a piece of Muppet magic home, in the form of a Kermit pillow or Beaker ski hat, there was a merchandise shop with an interior that resembled the stage set of Happiness Hotel from The Great Muppet Caper. Many of these Phase 1 projects were quickly greenlit and went directly into development and production, and some can still be seen in the park today. But there was a massive Phase 2 expansion of Muppet Studios planned, with Muppets-themed dark rides, attractions, and restaurants.
Jim was a very busy man, so I had very little contact with him. I only had one time that I had a chance to meet him, but we were meeting with the whole team. So Frank Oz was coming to the meetings. We were meeting with Michael Frith and a lot of the writers that Henson had on the properties, and we were sitting in meetings as we were coming up with all of these ideas for what we were going to be doing for everything from the ride to the land, how, the expansion of the theater show. For me, who had just come from animation, and animation can be very compartmentalized. They have an idea about what it is they want, and they reach out to the artist. I was very good at ideating, but this was a new experience to be sitting in this table, and this is what they call the blue sky process. I loved it. So imagine you're in a very large room, it's artwork all the way around all on the walls, and you're sitting in the table, and the goal here. Let's spitball some ideas. This is what we're proposing. What do you have in mind? And you have to just kind of come up with things. And at first, you figure I'm a very young man at this time. I was 24 years old. And so I was a little hesitant to participate in that process. But, the ideas start bubbling up in my head. And that was the process. And I found it so engaging. It's when I think of my time at Disney, that was one of the most exhilarating things was that ideation process. Because I was such a fan of the Muppets, I watched Sesame Street as a little kid, and then I watched The Muppet Show, that I felt like I really knew the property. I really knew the characters. And so it wasn't difficult in the least bit for me to participate in that process. I mean, I really felt like I was part of that team.
Jim Henson himself was deeply involved in the project. He was thrilled by the prospect of bringing Muppet Madness to a whole new audience. He saw the theme park as a canvas where his creations could thrive for generations. For Jim, it was a chance to do something new, unique, and groundbreaking. The immensely popular ride, Star Wars: Rise of the Resistance at Disney's Hollywood Studios, is located just behind Muppet Vision 3D. If Phase 2 of Muppet Studios expansion had gone as planned, there would be a much different ride in that location today.
A Muppets movie ride.
It'll be a backstage ride of explaining how movies are shot. And it's almost, but all the information is wrong.
That was such an exciting thing to develop this ride. When they gave us the assignment, and it's both Joe Lanzisser and myself had the assignment of creating this ride. Now, the ride was written by the Muppet writers and the Disney writers of what they wanted to do. And the idea was this: we're going to the Muppet Studios. This is where the Muppets make their films. When you're in the ride, you see the film as it's going to appear in the theaters. And then you go backstage and you get to see how they're filming it. And it's just Muppet mayhem, is what you would expect from the Muppets.
With a little help from Disney's audio animatronics, the Muppets would be cast in many of Hollywood's most iconic films.
Years ago, I had given this drawing to a friend of mine, and years later, he returned the drawing back to me. You've got Kermit the Frog as kind of like an Indiana Jones, and he's rescuing Miss Piggy from this waterfall. So you can see here that it's complete Muppet mayhem as they attempt to film the waterfall sequence where Kermit the Frog as Indiana Jones is attempting to rescue Miss Piggy. One of the things that we wanted to have Statler and Waldorf in the ride. So they're actually part of the group that is in the ride, that is riding along with us. And so they're sitting in an Omnimover. They've broken loose and they're actually in the waterfall. The first drawing that I had done was that Omnimover, like we have in the Haunted Mansion. But then I started thinking, I thought, I don't want to just do an Omnimover. I want to do something more theme related. So I thought, what if you had these vehicles that were like Omnimovers, but when they're in the station, when you're boarding them, they're all sort of together and it looks like it's a tram. And so you're boarding a tram. And then as the tram takes off and they start to separate, because it would be like on a bus bar system, and that they would separate and they would go into the ride. And then that explains why Statler and Waldorf have pulled away. So when it's all together, it looks like it's one big tram that you're boarding. But then when it takes off, they separate. And then Statler and Waldorf would also be in one as well. Yeah.
As your Omnitram approaches the scene from the Indiana Jones adventure, you pass a movie screen showing the heroic rescue of Miss Piggy by Kermit the Frog. The cinematography is flawless, and the scene looks Oscar-worthy. But past the screen, and you are suddenly backstage during the filming of that same scene. Complete Muppet pandemonium. Kermit looks like he needs saving himself. The rigging, made out of pipes, doesn't look like it would pass any kind of safety inspection. And who better to man the rope and pulley than the never-dependable Animal? As your tram leaves the scene, you hear cries for help, as Statler and Waldorf have literally gone off the rails. It seems that no iconic film is safe from the Muppets, and soon your Omnitram approaches the chariot race scene from the 1959 film Ben-Hur. But behind the screen, the horses are actually on stationary bikes that seem to be part of a much more rigorous workout program. The ancient Roman chariot race seems to have been invaded by World War II fighter planes. Of course, this is a great time for the Rat Tech crew to take a pizza break. And Gonzo the director has completely lost it. If you're wondering how the Muppets would capture the passion and drama of a love story set in Russia during World War I, you're about to find out. As your Omnitram enters a scene from the 1965 film Dr. Zhivago, Kermit and Miss Piggy are in a frozen embrace in a giant snow globe. Fozzie Bear and the rats are gently rocking the snow globe to maintain a bit of a flurry. But the director has gone to sleep, and this rat is sending a very clear message that this whole thing stinks. By 1990, Disney had already partnered with Lucasfilm for the Star Tours attraction. Star Wars was still a relatively young and extremely hot franchise, and its popularity initiated a massive wave of cinematic space epics. So obviously, the Great Muppet Movie Ride needed a pigs in space scene.
There's so much in that particular drawing, everything from, the characters firing the lasers. Some are terrified, some are losing their balance, and then we just get to see all the little reflections on the glass. And then there's another little rat that's down by the engine, and he's cooking hot dogs. How can we get these characters to feel as though each individual one is an individual experience, is an individual life, having an experience? They ask you to do things like design the Muppet ride or design the Roger Rabbit ride or design a film. And you're starting from a blank page. And what I do is I I close my eyes and I pretend I'm in the theater, or I close my eyes and I pretend I'm in the ride vehicle. Like in my imagination, I conjure what these things are going to look like, and then they become a reality, and then I draw them. And then sometimes they get designed and turned into a reality. But this is one that didn't. So I still, in my mind's eye, that thing is still rocking back and forth, and I still see the lasers and, as though it were built.
There are also scenes from this ride which were illustrated by Marcello's colleague, Joe Lanzicero. In the Muppets live-action Peter Pan scene, Kermit, as Peter, is trying to get his group off to Neverland. However, Miss Piggy has demanded the role of Tinkerbell. The rat technicians clearly do not have the strength to gracefully glide Miss Piggy through the scene, so she ends up terrorizing the entire cast and crew as she flies out of control, destroying all of London and crashing right through the backdrop. In this scene, Kermit and Miss Piggy have stumbled through a hidden passage and discover a secret laboratory. This scene is taken from the 1931 iconic horror film Frankenstein. Dr. Bunsen Honeydew attempts to create life by assembling a creature made from body parts of the deceased. And in the process, he has created a 10-foot-tall beaker.
They were very happy with the work that I was doing on the Muppet ride, that they asked me to work on a bunch of the other properties. And so there was the restaurant, and then there was the cafe. There was the Hard Luck Cafe.
The location now inhabited by the Mama Melrose restaurant at Disney's Hollywood Studios was originally intended to be something entirely different. The Great Gonzo's Pizza Pandemonium Parlor, a full-service restaurant managed by an easily distracted Gonzo and his chaos-infested friend, Rizzo the Rat. Here, your meal comes with a side of mayhem. At any moment, the kitchen doors might burst open, sending a cloud of chicken feathers into the air. The Swedish chef in a life-and-death battle with the poultry and seafood. Overhead television monitors would capture the culinary mayhem for all to see. And then there was the Hard Luck Cafe. This would have been a quick-service restaurant at Muppet Studios, but that didn't mean there would be any shortage on design detail.
You can see the scope of the restaurant, trying to design, like what was in this restaurant? What were we going to see? And just generating a bunch of different ideas. And a lot of that was about generating ideas, trying to be clever, trying to create a space that we were engaged in. And these were built off the physical blueprints. So they brought the blueprints into my office. So these would be the architects brought these blueprints. And at the time, there was no, you figure there was no AI, there was no CAD system, which is a computer-aided drawings where they would build something in 3D. There was none of that. These were architectural drawings that they would bring into my office, and I would roll the drawings out on my drafting table. And then there's a process by which you can transfer all those points onto a vanishing point and then draw out what it would look like from that specific angle. And so that's how I transfer the drawings. So the drawings were drawn to scale for what that space would be. They would also bring by things like, we know we want to have posters in this space. They brought by some press images of the characters, the Muppet characters, because you figure there's no internet. You can't just go online and just Google these things. You have to have a physical, tangible thing in your hand. And they kind of gave me an idea about what they wanted to do with the tables and the chairs and how the walls were going to be brick. And they wanted it to look like a Hard Rock Cafe. And that's it. And the rest is like, now have at it. Make this place look believable. And that's what I did. And if you can also see, like all the way here in the background, right there, you can see I snuck in Jim Henson. So this is the plane. These are the wings. These are the wheels. The symbol is the rear wheel. And then it's got the tail fin that's going back, which is a guitar, and it has a broken guitar over the back. So it's a giant airplane that's sitting over the entire restaurant, but it's actually made of musical instruments. And it would be like Dr. Teeth's toothbrush, just to create funny Muppet mayhem sort of things. There were little tiny things like on the hamburger. If you look right on top of the hamburger, there's like a little guitar, little ideas like, what if, when you get your hamburger and they have to put like, whether it's a medium rare or it's a well done hamburger, and that you would get this toothpick that sits inside of it. What if that looks like a little guitar from the Hard Luck Cafe, and that it's inside there? So you can see here, like they've blown out one of their amplifiers, right? Because the music was just so loud, they just blew the thing up, and we have this thing on display. So it's basically, it's like a Hard Luck Cafe or a Hard Rock Cafe. So you would have all of the typical things that you would have in the music industry, but also but what if it was all Muppet related, so that you would have, things like this, which is like when they fail, when they break things, when they've eaten things that they shouldn't have eaten, and just to have as much fun as possible. Even like if there's a pizza slice that's inside like a picture frame, just a bunch of silly things. Yeah, and then also I snuck my grandfather in all the way over here. But I do believe that when you want to engage an audience in the artwork, the important thing is to give them Easter eggs, because a lot of times in art, what you see is what you get, and then within a few seconds, somebody can look at a piece of artwork and they're done. They don't need to see any more. And something can be very finely painted or finely rendered, but they're done. And so the important thing is, how do you keep them engaged? And you can see that all of the work that I had done for the Muppets was all about engagement. How do I keep the audience completely riveted so that they'll do just that? They'll go through and just look at and spend the time to look at the expressions, spend the time to look at what's this character doing? Why is that toothbrush there? That kind of thing. Why does that record? Why does it have a bite taken at? Who took that bite? And I think that that's a lot more engaging. And I think that was really amenable to the Muppet property, because the Muppets are just that. When you're watching the Muppets, these characters are doing something, and there's something funny happening in the background, and so there was always this level of engagement with that.
Although Jim Henson was not physically at the Imagineering office in Florida, his presence was always felt, as he was still guiding and directing these projects from off-site.
This is something I wanted to share with you, and I have it right here. It was when I started generating artwork for the Hensons, that Jim Henson was so appreciative of what I was doing that they gave me this watch. Now, it's no real big deal. It's not like an expensive watch or anything, but I still keep it in the plastic that I received it in, and it's a Kermit the Frog watch. Let me see if I can turn it there. Right there, it's Kermit the Frog watch, and it means a lot to me, and I still keep it in the plastic that I received it in, and I'll take it out on special occasions and wear it. But it meant so much to me that that this was an appreciation from Jim himself to me for the work that I had done.
But fate had other plans. On the morning of May 16th, 1990, the world was stunned by the unexpected death of Jim Henson. His passing left a void that could never be filled, and it also cast a shadow over the future of Muppet Studios. Jim had never signed a contract with Disney, leaving the control of the Muppets in a state of uncertainty.
When Jim Henson passed away, it was utterly devastating. What a punch to the gut that was. I had driven to work, and for whatever reason, I wasn't listening to the radio at all. So I came into work and I had no idea what had happened, and it was all over the news. And I got to work, and everybody just, I mean, you could just feel it, the weight, like something happened. And I went into Joe's office, and then Joe was just, he was as white as a sheet, and he could barely, get the words out to tell me what happened. And he was just so emotionally wrought. And I took it well. And I went back to my office. Whew, it still hits me. And I just started crying. That was hard. We had just gone to New York to see Jim Henson. And that's when I got a chance to meet him 2 weeks earlier. And we all got a picture together at the studio. And I got a chance to thank him for the watch that he had sent. And it was one of those where it was a wonderful meeting. We all got together and we were talking about that process, like what we were planning to do for the Muppet properties, et cetera. And we also got a chance to go backstage to see what was happening in the development of the characters and things like that, and into the creature shop. And that was just 2 weeks earlier. And then he passed away. That was, like I said, that was really devastating.
The Henson family and Disney found themselves embroiled in a dispute, and the dream of a Muppet Studios expansion was ultimately canceled. But there was so much hard work and love that went into the Disney and Jim Henson collaboration that it wasn't long until that spirit of mayhem and play that would have been the heart of Muppet Studios found another outlet.
When Jim died, the dynamics of that whole deal that Disney was working out had evaporated, because Jim was no longer part of that process. The whole deal, the complexion of the whole deal changed. But from that, Mrs. Disney's got this other idea, which was designing a Toontown. There was this Disney Afternoon had set up this, because you had the Disney Afternoon television shows, and the kids loved to see this. And it was a meet and greet. So they had these little cutouts, and it was like Mickey Starland. And this was in Florida. And so we said, okay, we want to build a Mickey Starland for California. And then that just sort of snowballed. And so suddenly it started to grow, and it started to get bigger and bigger and bigger. That was the inception. That was creation of Toontown and what became Toontown. So in a way, the enthusiasm and the scope of Toontown is probably very similar to what we had intended for the Muppet property when we were working on that.
Muppets fans will always feel a sense of melancholy when they think about this lost Muppet land. But Marcelo brought the spirit of chaotic fun and community that was born during the planning of Muppet Studios and applied these characteristics during the creation of Toontown for both Disneyland in California as well as Tokyo Disneyland. And finally, every ounce of mayhem that was imagined for his previous Muppet projects was poured into Marcelo's designs for Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin. You can still visit the Muppets at Disney's Hollywood Studios at Walt Disney World. Inside the pre-show area of Muppet Vision 3D, look for the packing crates that are mostly full of Miss Piggy's really fancy satin gowns. These crates were delivered to Muppet Studios, Orlando, Florida. This is the only reference to this lost Muppet land that still exists in the parks today.